Today, the truth and lies of auction clearance rates. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, world's latest post covering finance and problem news with a distinctively Australian flavour. And I'm joined for an audio conversation with Keith Almeida from FreshCanvas. Hello, Keith.
Hi, good to meet you, Martin.
Great to have you on board. And I know we're only going to go audio today, but I think there's a really interesting conversation to be had because you sent some information to me about 3 weeks ago relating to auction clearance rates. And essentially, my understanding is that you've got a rather different perspective about what the reality with regard to auction clearance rates are compared with perhaps those out in the public domain. And of course, everybody watches the auction clearance rates like mad, so it's a pretty important conversation. So maybe just give us a little bit of background to FreshCanvas, and then we'll have a more detailed conversation about the auction clearance rates.
Yeah, definitely. So we're a data and digital firm, and I'm actually an actuary by background, so I'm quite good with numbers, maths, statistics, and that kind of stuff. And one of the things that we do is just we look at various data sources and we essentially scrape them from online listings. So whether that be in this case auction clearance rates, or it can be prices, or it can be anything really that you can find online. So one of the things that we were interested in, and this was initially driven by my personal circumstances actually, was auction clearance rates. So essentially I saw these numbers in the news that were just going up week on week. And when I was going to some auctions, yes, it's true that some are going bananas and they're going well above reserve and there's 1,000 people at the auction, but that wasn't my experience for every auction. And if you think the media is reporting an 80% clearance rate, 4 out of 5 auctions I was going to weren't actually clearing. I know myself, it's obviously a small sample. I'm not I can't go to every single auction and look at that, but it just gave me a feeling that it wasn't as what was being reported. So with that in mind, what we did is we actually did something quite simple actually, but nevertheless quite useful. We looked at first of all, on the Friday night, we looked at all auctions that were scheduled for the upcoming Saturday and Sunday for all states across Australia. And we got all those addresses and we got the agents and all that kind of stuff. And then what we did is on the following Tuesday evening, for all those addresses that were scheduled to go to auction, we looked at their status on domain.com or realestate.com.au, whatever you will. So there's 3 possible statuses that it could be. It could be sold, and that could be sold at auction or sold shortly thereafter. It could be for sale, which probably means that the auction has fallen through for whatever reason, or could actually be a third status, which is for rent, which probably means that it's been sold to an investor and it's been immediately put up for rent. But that's a small proportion. So with that in mind, how does my analysis differ to what Domain posts? So there's a couple of key differences. First of all, because we look at auctions that are scheduled for the upcoming weekend, what I actually noticed in the Domain results is that they report stuff that was perhaps scheduled for the weekend, but already sold prior to auction 1 or 2 weeks before. So in my mind, when I think of an auction clearance rate, I think of something that has gone to auction and cleared, not sold 2 or 3 weeks prior. But that's just me. And then the next thing that differs from Domain is you notice that in Domain they have a lot of stuff that's unreported and there's no status available on those, whereas we pretty much captured every single listing that was scheduled to go to auction on that weekend. So that's where the main differences occur, and that's why I suppose we're getting slightly different numbers to what Domain reports.
Well, that's very interesting because I noticed that with Domain, for example, when they start reporting, because of the large proportion of underreported, I think they proxy those across. In other words, the results they've got, they assume is consistent with all the other ones they're going to get. So effectively, when they come out with a clearance rate, it tends to make an assumption about what they're going to end up with at the end of the process, right? And I guess my observation would be that, well, that may or may not be right. But of course, if an real estate agent sold a property, they're probably more likely to want to actually get that information into the system. Whereas if they didn't, if they weren't successful, if they put the property back on the market, they're perhaps going to be less enthusiastic about reporting it. So in a way, the non-reports or the slow reports could well be biased more to the, than haven't sold rather than the have sold proportion. And the other interesting question is precisely the period over which information is reported. Because, for example, CoreLogic seems to indicate to me, if I look at their terms of reference, the terms and conditions, it's within the week. So they've actually got quite a broad period when they count it. And I suspect that some of the reporting from the agents will be sold prior, sold after, as well as auction clearances. So the point I guess you're making, and the point that I keep making, is you can't necessarily assume that the information as reported is 100% accurate, right? And your numbers typically are coming out, what, 10 to 15% lower than the official figures, or the Domain official figures?
Yeah, that's right. So I was just looking at the numbers actually for last week, and when I looked at the clearances for New South Wales, for example, our figure as a percentage was 57%, and I think on Domain it's close to 80%. So as I mentioned, part of that is because Domain is not really reporting all the results, or is not able to report all the results, and also because they're including a lot of things that were sold prior to auction. In some case, 2 to 3 weeks before that auction date, it's included in that data set as an auction clearance, which that's just my opinion. That's not entirely reflective, because if I just put myself in the shoes of a vendor and I'm coming up to my auction date and it's the Friday night, if I'm seeing 80% clearance rates, then I'm going to feel pretty confident that it's going to sell at auction. But if I see 57 at that point of time, then that's a bit of a different story. So that's just my perspective, though, and that's if I would want to have this information as a vendor to make a decision. For example, if I were to take pre-auction offers or things like that. So
well, that's right, because if in fact you're hearing that clearance rates are 80%, then you might be more persuaded to go down the auction path. Whereas if you had a 57% clearance rate, that's just over half, you might have a different decision, because there are lots of costs, of course, involved in the auction.
Yeah.
And I guess the other question is, what was the relative volumes? Did you have a similar initial volume, or are your volumes different from the ones that Domain reports in terms of, if you like, the list of available auctions?
Yeah, so that's another interesting point. So let's say on the Friday, Domain are saying there's 900 scheduled auctions for this upcoming weekend, which they freely publish. We collect all 900, so the scheduled auction for our purposes is 900. But when they actually report the results on the following Sunday or Monday, that number actually changes. And again, I suspect that's because they're getting stuff that was sold prior to auction and including them that week. So there's an uplift there. So they're including all the stuff that's being brought in from that sold previously, and then and that's just inflating the final numbers as well.
Sure. And have you ever observed multiple reportings? In other words, the same auction result appearing in multiple weeks, or does that not happen?
I guess from our perspective, we don't really look at that, and it doesn't influence our figures, because when we look at the upcoming auctions on the Friday, that's not going to be listed twice. I mean, unless it's by some fluke error, and even then we can remove the duplicates from the data. So we haven't actually observed that. And then if you think about the result, when you look at the results on the Tuesday, when you look at each address once as well, so there's no real issue of those duplicates. So I can't really comment if the domain results or have multiple entries in there. I must confess, I haven't really looked into that in detail. So it didn't have any impact on our results.
Well, it's interesting because I was prompted to ask that because I've had a couple of people over the last couple of months say to me, I'm sure I've seen that one reported previously on domain and it's reported again. So I don't know, but I'm just intrigued. So, the takeout from all this, of course, is that the numbers, and the way they're reported may not actually give a true and fair and 100% clear representation of precisely what's happening. So people should just be a little cautious and a little careful with regard to those headline auction clearance rates, which of course appear in the news on the Saturday and the Sunday, because there's actually a lot more going on than may appear from those headlines.
Yeah, exactly. So I suppose the real question that we were trying to answer with our data is if I'm going to take my property to auction on this weekend, what is the chance that I'm going to find a buyer or an acceptable buyer, either at that auction or in the next day, I suppose. So that's the question that we're trying to answer with this analysis. That's, I suppose, our scope.
And therefore, your conclusion is it's probably a lower probability of a successful auction on average relative to what might be perceived to be the answer based on some of the publicly available information.
Yeah, I would say that's a fair assessment of the situation.
Yeah. So just in terms of FreshCanvas, are you going to make this information more widely available, or is it just for your own interest, or what's your thought there?
So I guess it started out as an interest project, but actually it is actually quite interesting, and I think as such the data is actually quite valuable. So we might look to actually commercialize this in some way. So an example could be if we track this over time and by things like statistical SA4, which is statistical area 4, we can see trends over time, and then perhaps economic models or financial models could actually use this as an input into whatever they're forecasting, for example. Because we all hear economists regularly quote and even sometimes in the RBA quotes the auction clearance rates, and if they're working on in my view, slightly misleading or incorrect clearance rate, that could distort models and things like that. So in our view, our number's a bit more accurate, therefore I think it has some value.
Well, I think so too. So good luck with that. And Keith, I really thank you for your time this evening. It's a very, very interesting conversation. And, once again, we should underscore that be careful with statistics because sometimes they can be misleading.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Good to talk to you. Thanks very much, Keith.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye. So there you have it, a really interesting perspective from Keith, and it really confirms something which I've seen from my own analysis, and that is that the high-level numbers as published aren't telling the full story. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.